All right. Well, to all of you who are here, thank you, thank you, thank you. We so appreciate you joining this special virtual conversation, Complicating the Narrative of Hate Crime Coverage, brought to you by Not in Our Town and the Solutions Journalism Network. Just as you heard, and a reminder, this is being recorded. So you will get this recording. You will also get all of the resources and more that we discussed today in a follow-up email. And we realize that many of you might be meeting us for the very first time. So I'll just quickly introduce myself and toss over to Patrice, who will set up a video that will really get things rolling for us. So my name is Helene Biandudi Hofer, and I am a journalist, a filmmaker, and the manager of Complicating the Narratives at the Solutions Journalism Network. And complicating the narratives, you're probably like, what is that? What does that mean? And it's a journalistic practice, and it's informed by the work of experts in conflict. So think conflict mediators, diplomats, psychologists, rabbis, ministers, and others. And so some of the strategies that we use are intended to help journalists tell much more nuanced and inclusive stories about complicated issues. And I will toss to my co-moderator here and facilitator today, Patrice O'Neill, to introduce herself.
Hi, I'm so excited to be here and to learn from everyone on this call. And I learned so much from Helene. She's a remarkable producer and journalist. Hate's been my beat for 25 years, and it isn't something that I necessarily chose, but I'm a documentary filmmaker, and I covered a story that I'll tell you more about a couple of decades ago about people standing up to hate. And it really changed the nature of the work of our media company and how I saw filmmaking and how I understood what it meant to really follow a story. So be careful what you get good at. Anyway, I'm so honored to have spent some time learning from people around the country and around the world who have made a decision to stand up to hate. And I think their stories are so often undertold, and it's one of the reasons we decided to do this session today. I'm really excited to introduce one of my colleagues who I met during the course of a film, Pardeep Kaleka, and hopefully we can learn together. As I said, we've been covering these issues for many years. This very short piece, about 5 minutes, will remind us of some of the trauma that has been experienced in our country, and also what's possible if we think about what we can do together.
Creek 911, where's your emergency?
Yeah, I was just going to Sikh Temple.
There is shooting.
Okay, did anybody get hit? Hello?
Somebody called and said, your dad's been shot.
It's hard to think that it happened to us, such a small community, such a tight community. It was shocking.
Beautiful, godly, caring people spending time together in prayer and Bible study. And a young man came into this wonderful historic church and he killed them.
Darkness came from outside of our city. And I want to make it very clear. We are people of light, and we hope that this will never repeat again anywhere.
Tonight, Pittsburgh's Tree of Life Synagogue is home to heartbreak and carnage, believed to be the deadliest attack on Jews in U.S. history.
This was an attack not just on Tree of Life. This was an attack upon Pittsburgh. And all of Pittsburgh is mourning this and feeling the pain and looking for answers.
America is just now coming to grips with what unfolded here in the early morning hours here in Orlando, a massacre at a gay nightclub.
My son hasn't been heard from, so I don't know if he was left in the club, if he got shot. It's terrible. He's my only child.
I don't want other mothers to be in my spot. I don't want other mothers to go through this.
This was not an ordinary call. I try not to get personally involved in the cases, but it's hard in something like this. A Native American branded with a swastika.
Why would they hurt me?
I am going to make sure that we find out what happened. And I want the people that did this to be held accountable.
The vast majority of hate crimes are never reported to the police. I see trauma that's sort of inflicted on victims when charges are not brought, when it's not recognized what happened to them.
I remember laying on the ground after being attacked and really just feeling like, this is it. This is how a trans woman dies.
El primer golpe yo lo sentí que de allá no sé cómo pude escapar.
And the people need to feel comfortable, regardless of their immigration status, to come to us.
The day of the Temple shooting, I had been shot 15 times. I'd go right out and take another 12 if I knew that the Sikh community could actually be noticed for who they are.
As much as you were going through these feelings of grief, so was the rest of this community. And the rest of the community literally took their arms, braced them around you, and took that burden of pain away.
It causes me to pull on a whole higher level of faith, soul searching. But it also provokes a higher act of love.
The parents of Richard Collins III are pushing for legislation that would clarify that hate does not have to be the sole motivation for a hate crime.
It's the thing that we owe to our son's legacy.
The hope in this, I guess, campaign after my brother's death is to bring awareness to victims' rights so that, they don't have to feel like they don't have a voice, and what can we do to help protect them.
We need to change the conditions that allow for hatred and violence to thrive in this city.
We only need to stand together to ensure that these acts of violence that are based on racist behavior or gender or any other type of hate are turned around and that we will not allow them to happen in our city.
We can accomplish things that set examples across the nation, across the world. We can make a change that's real.
Well, Patrice, thank you for that. And I have, as a journalist and a filmmaker, worked with you and worked with Not in Our Town, and I have learned just a great deal from you and from the work being done, not just in communities all over, but just really how to think differently about this. And even as a member of my local community here, the role that I play and really doing something about this. And, with the onslaught of hate crimes happening in this country and around the world, we have received lots of questions from journalists about how can we cover these crimes, this crisis differently? How can we produce stories that provide necessary context, don't make the perpetrators the object of fascination, stories that really do cause audiences to self-reflect and think about their role in their community and how they can collaborate, not just with members of their community, but other communities, whether in their state or across the country. And I know that this in part is why, the two of us, we talked and we thought, let's bring NIOT and SJN together to collaborate on this virtual conversation. And so with that, we turn to you, to all of you, and we have much gratitude for you making the time to be here. And it would be helpful for us to know, and also for our panelists to know, what brought you to today's virtual conversation. You're a journalist, and maybe you're thinking about challenges that you yourself have had when it comes to reporting on hate crimes that you might be thinking about, you might be carrying with you today. Do you have hopes for today's conversation? So if you will, please share, just drop, you don't have to put too much in, but just drop some information in the chat, just so we know about really what's top of mind for you. And maybe Patrice, I won't be able to pull it up on my chat, but maybe if you see anything that you'd like to share when people drop it, please feel free to do that.
I know that there are some people like Charlie from Wilmington Normal, who work in communities where there are very active anti-hate organizations like Not in Our Town. He's been a radio reporter for many years, and I hope during the conversation we can hear from him about what it's like to cover that movement also. A lot of people saying, well, some people saying they want to be prepared to cover a hate crime, which is unfortunate, but true. I think we have to prepare.
That's
because it's so pervasive.
That's right. Yeah, I know my background is in broadcasting, and when something happens, there's just, you kind of flip and you go into speed mode, and there are just certain things, strategies that you really do want to have available to you in advance and in preparation. So because the natural default is to go back to our old way of doing things, traditional way of doing things, which is just reporting on what happens. And this is about really, really changing that and reframing that. So for sure, today we'll talk about that, so people do feel as though they are equipped.
Yeah. So.
All right. Anything else you'd like to share? Anything you're seeing, Patrice, before we introduce our panelists?
So there are some discussions about understanding relationships between law enforcement and communities in the coverage of hate crimes. I hope we get a chance to talk about that.
Yeah.
Story about asylum seekers and refugees, hate crimes targeting immigrants, learning to find nuance in reporting. So I think there are some journalism teachers here who want to think about how to think differently and present alternatives to their students. This one I'm really excited at talking about, although I don't know if it could be a whole session, Helene, about historical narratives. What is happening in your community? What is the history of harm that is emerging as hate incidents may occur that are bringing up that historical narrative? And I think it's a longer conversation, but so important. I think you can't really begin to heal if you don't understand past harms. Just the past week, we've been looking at Tulsa, and finally acknowledging that deep, horrific harm that occurred in our country. So really thoughtful, I think, responses to the questions. Crimes against LGBTQ people.
All right. Well, I know that, thank you for sharing those. Thank you for responding to that as well, and sharing what you're really carrying with you, and bringing with you today, and elements of that Patrice shared and that you've dropped in the chat, we will be covering in our conversation. And we will make sure, on our end, to loop back to some of those questions throughout the conversation as well. So without further ado, Patrice, let's introduce our phenomenal panelists and speakers today.
So Pardeep Kaleka is an inspiring speaker and leader. He's director of the Interfaith Conference of Milwaukee. He's a therapist, he's an educator, former police officer, a member of the Sikh community, and someone obviously who understands the trauma caused by hate on a deeply personal level. I have had the opportunity to work with Pardeep over these many years since we produced the film Waking in Oak Creek, and have learned so much from him. He is such an informed voice in the fight against hate, because he not only has the experience of a survivor and a hate crime victim, he has all the varied experiences that we talk about. And I think, well, you know what, I'm just gonna let him speak and introduce himself and just say a few words. We're gonna get into a Q&A in a minute, but Pardeep, thanks for joining us from Milwaukee, Wisconsin.
Thank you so much, Patrice and Helene. Thank you for having me on today. It's an honor to be on with everyone. God bless you all for going into journalism. It's a tough field. Patrice, I think about all the times that we had this discussion, and yes, it is it's a weighty topic. And I think that both of us hanging out with one another personally, oftentimes when we're away from the work that we do, Patrice and I like to laugh quite a bit. And if I can encourage one thing out of this, not hopefully we encourage a lot of things, is to, sometimes just express your emotions, laugh, kind of when you're away from everything that's happening. Obviously, vicarious trauma is a very real thing. Reporting on it, you're going to care very deeply about. A lot of times you're spending some very intimate time with people, but make sure that you can walk away from a little bit, and whatever it is that you need to express, whether it's you need to vent, scream, cuss, laugh, cry, so I think that Patrice and I really like to laugh every once in a while and be sincere about life, but not take things too seriously. So yeah, thank you.
This is what I'm talking about every time. Thank you, Pardeep. We'll talk more soon.
Great. Thank you, Pardeep. And also joining us today is an incredible journalist by the name of Smriti Jacob. Smriti is the managing editor of the Rochester Beacon in Rochester, New York, and I am so fortunate to be able to have her as a colleague and to have her as a neighbor, to have her as a thought partner, and the work that we do as journalists. She had a recent article titled "The Bigotry Asian Americans Face," and she really did examine the pervasive stereotypes of Asian Americans, also the nuances within the Asian American community. And I've learned so much from her. This is the type of a journalist that really embraces community and embeds herself into different communities, has been able to develop a genuine and sincere level of trust with people. I'm just amazed at how she gets people to really, how she shows that she's really listening, and she's able to get people to open up and really bring, kind of capture the essence of a person and what they're dealing with in ways that we sometimes miss as journalists because we are, dealing with very real deadlines. And Smriti knows how to slow down and to be present and to make someone feel and know that they are all that she really cares about in that moment, and making sure that she authentically captures them and their story. So Smriti, I'll please say a few words, but thank you for being here too.
I don't know if I'm all that.
Oh, and she's humble too, as you should know.
And we certainly need to update that photo, that's for sure. But thank you, Helene. For me, really, we started the Rochester Beacon about almost 3 years ago. We're in our finishing up a third year. We started to be part of the community. And that's So when you say that I bring that, I take that very deeply. It's a big compliment to me that you think that we do that. And all I want really is for us all to see the humanity in each other. And if I can do that through my stories, hopefully that makes a difference and brings us together.
Thank you.
So, Helene, before we move on, I want to also introduce my colleague, Teresa Riley, who is an amazing partner in this work. I met her when she was at POV, and then worked with her at PBS, and she is the editor of NIOT.org. She works for Bill Moyers, has worked for Bill Moyers for many years. Really wonderful journalist and thought partner for us here at Not in Our Town. So she'll be moderating the chat with us and part of the team today.
Thank you, Patrice. Hi, everybody.
Thank you, Teresa. All right, so we have some goals for our time together today, and really our hope is that this time will help address some of the challenges that you brought up in the chat, and just really we want to make sure that you are able to walk away with a deeper understanding of the problem when it comes to the problem with how hate crime coverage has been done, and also how we can reframe it. The strategies and tools, we want them to be at your fingertips so you can really think about your coverage moving forward and doing it, in a different way. And so we will work on all the things that you see on your screen, and we really are resources for you too. Our hope is that, this today is not the end, that we're able to continue to communicate and to collaborate and answer questions. And we do also want to make this interactive. So we are going to set aside time at the end so you can ask any of the panelists, any of us questions. If you want to drop an idea that we just can discuss, by all means, we will make the time to do that because this is for you. And so, Patrice, before we get into ideas and strategies and solutions for journalists, would you please first help us to really set up the problem? What's the problem with hate crime coverage in the news media today?
So, this is a picture of people in Billings, Montana. It was taken by this amazing photographer of people holding menorahs. And I'll tell you that story briefly as we move forward. But our work at Not in Our Town is focused on telling stories and sharing strategies for communities responding to hate. Let's go to the next slide. Two more slides. Sorry, that was okay. For earlier. 2 more slides. So I think, on the ground, let's go back to on the ground. I think many of you, one more back, Helene. So I think many of you are seeing these on the ground, these manifestations of hate in your communities. I know for us, it's deeply personal. Outside our office in Chinatown, we had seniors being attacked on the street. We see it on the news every night here in the Bay Area of Asian people being attacked. They, of course, aren't the only victims, but thousands and thousands of people have been attacked, and the impact cannot be understated on the terror that people feel. Hate groups are rising. I think January 6th was, made that very apparent. I remember doing you look at groups like the Oath Keepers, and I remember doing about 4 years ago, doing a webinar for some of our folks in Bowling Green, Ohio, who had Oath Keepers organizing, and we brought in groups from another leader from Oregon who was facing the Oath Keepers there, and got them in conversation about the dangers. You look at the Oath Keepers, they're, an example of a group that perhaps seemed benign to people when they first emerged. They embedded themselves as EMTs and local Little League coaches, etc. So there are these sort of outwardly facing apparent white supremacists, but the ongoing threat may be invisible. And let's go to the next slide. So I think, Helene, the next slide about the hate crimes reporting gap. So the video alludes to this, and those of you who have followed ProPublica and their Documenting Hate project, I'm sure know this, but I think it's an important reminder. So every year, in the previous administration, there were these studies. The FBI gives us the official hate crime statistics, and this is the last year we have real comparative data. 2018, the 2019, the official stats, under 9,000 officially reported hate victimizations, right? Hate crimes. The Bureau of Justice Statistics estimate there are at least 250,000 hate crimes that occur every year. So there is this huge gap in the number that are officially counted and the harm that is taking place. And that is such an important story as you think about what's missing in your coverage in local communities. What are we not seeing? What are we missing? And it is dramatic. There are many reasons for the underreporting. Some of it is, language, fear of police or dislike of police, police not being prepared or interested in taking the reports. Sometimes it's internal shame, sort of like rape. Hate crimes are often like rape. Just the trauma of hate is so deep that people do not want to report it and do not want to interact with the justice system. So, we with Not in Our Town have been trying to document and think about other ways people can report so we can get underneath that story. And I hope this is something that you take with this from this webinar, no matter what. Understand the deep underlying harm that is taking place every single day. And it may not be people who are aligned with white supremacist groups, but it is the pervasive racism and intolerance that is on the rise and surging, and people are experiencing every single day. Let's go to the next one. So I'm going to tell you a story that taught us a lot about how to think about reframing our coverage of hate. It was back in the 90s, the white supremacist movement was organizing. People in Billings, Montana experienced a rash of hate crimes, flyers, graves overturned at the Jewish cemetery. But there was a force of people, including the police chief, who was an early adherent to community policing, who said, we need to respond as a community. This isn't just a law enforcement issue. This is something that we have to do together. So when a Black church had skinheads show up, members of other denominations went to the church and the skinheads went away. When a Native American woman's house was plastered with racist graffiti, 30 members of the Painters Union showed up to paint it over, and 100 neighbors were there to watch. The culminating event took place when a 6-year-old Jewish boy had a cinder block thrown through his window after he'd placed a menorah in his window for Hanukkah. And people in the town said, what if we're all Jewish? In an act of solidarity, they put menorahs in their windows. 10,000 people put menorahs in their windows, and the skinheads went away. So there's so much we learned about this. Let's just go through a few of the things that we learned from this story and the response to the story, which was tremendous. So let's go to the next slide. Well, covering community action, right? So the story was, of the painters. They could have gone quietly. The local newspaper covered it, and people in the community spread this idea that we are going to go witness and support this response to hate. There was a man in the film who was scraping paint as he spoke, and he said, I always wanted to do something about racism, but I never found a way to do something. And this gave us a way to send a message to the entire community. This is how we feel. We are painting over this message. We reject this message. That painter became a touchstone for people who watched this film. It was just a tremendous response to his very simple comment. Let's go to the next slide. So covering the story of the harm, both for Reverend Freeman, whose church was filled with skinheads, from Don Fasthorse, whose house was painted over, and from the Schnitzer family, who had, whose 6-year-old boy was terrorized by an attack in his bedroom. So understanding their stories was so important to this, and really hearing from them about not just the harm that they felt, but their experience of seeing the community support them. Next slide. And then it was about presenting an opportunity for engagement. So that was what we were doing with our film, which aired on PBS. We thought we'd do 10 town hall meetings around the film to see if people would talk about their own town. There were over 100. So with this film, we were presenting an opportunity for engagement. But we, as journalists, were replicating what the Billings Gazette did, which is, at the request of victims of the Schnitzer family and other human rights leaders in the town, the Billings Gazette printed a full-page menorah in the newspaper and said, and urged people in the town to put it up in their windows. And that was a very simple thing that they did to give the people of Billings an opportunity to engage. And I think really thinking about that, what opportunities are we providing for engagement, even if it's as simple as putting a piece of paper in your window. So let's move on. I don't know where we are on time. I guess to say, you know, clearly the end of the story is really the beginning of the story for us. So, you know, you tell the story, but then what do you do next? How do you follow it? How do you cover the conversations that ensue in the aftermath of reporting about a hate crime, an incident, a harm? What about those conversations and the ideas that emerge from those conversations? That is so rich. It is the source of most of our storytelling. We do not focus on the crime or the perpetrator. We focused on those who are harmed, but also what people do next. There is so much inherent drama here that is completely undercovered. Let's go to the next slide. So we have followed a network of people who have taken the name. This was not anything that we planned. Oh, let's start an anti-hate movement by doing a film. It's like, it was not, you know, something that we expected to do, but we followed the story, and we followed the story of people who were building upon this story. They make up a network of communities that inform our work, that really everything we do is informed by, like, what can we learn from them that we can share with others? What are they saying that they need? So let's go to the next story. So, you know, I think we've all seen the rise in anti-immigrant hate violence in our country. It's been rising for a long time. And people in our network came and said, hey, where's the next Not in Our Town story about anti-immigrant violence? Well, of course, as journalists, you know, you can't make up that story. You can't, like, invent a story. There were many, many, many stories, and we started 3 different films about the rise in anti-immigrant violence. But that is not the story we were looking for, because many journalists were covering that. You could see that. It was apparent in the news all over. What we were looking for is an example of a community trying to do something about it. And that's how we found Light in the Darkness. And I'll just tell you something brief about this that I think is so important. It's a story of a community responding after Marcelo Lucero, an Ecuadorian immigrant, was murdered in the town of Patchogue, New York. And his killing came after months and months of a group of high school students roaming the streets of this town looking for Mexicans to beat up. And so many people were harmed before Marcelo Lucero was killed. And the crimes were not reported, either because people were afraid. Sometimes they tried to report them and the police ignored them and said, oh, it's just young people, it's just kids, right? So the lack of reporting, the underreporting is can have horrific consequences. And so I hope you get a chance to look at that. Let's go back to the next slide and remind all of us about the hate crimes reporting gap. I think if you look at Waking Oak Creek, we'll talk about in a minute with Pardeep, crimes against Sikhs were not reported in the official statistics before the killings in Oak Creek. There was no way you could tell how many Sikh people were being harmed. And we see that now, right? In our town near here in San Jose, we just had, the murders of the attacks on the Sikh man who was here. And then in Indiana, we had so many people who were in that attack, who were killed in that attack. Counting the number of victims who are Sikh, really, really important, in the number of hate crimes. Counting is important. Understanding that data is super important. So I'm going to stop there because I know we have a lot to get through, but I just wanted to sort of give you a sense of some of the things we think about as we choose our stories and what we've learned.
Patrice, thank you. And we'll kind of loop in some of what you shared too in the course of the conversation that I have with Smriti in just a moment. We know that there are narratives directly connected to acts of hate that get overlooked. And yet they add accuracy and complexity and value to the stories that we tell. And these narratives, they get personal, and they really do provide a deeper understanding of, Patrice mentioned, covering the harm. And when we do that, we need to understand really at a deeper level how this is affecting, how acts of hate are affecting targeted communities. And they can help, they really can help the people we serve, our audiences, understand their role in addressing these issues. In our reporting, we can provide actions for people to take that really do promote a sense of agency, collaboration, instead of continuing to provoke more fear, which can happen in our reporting. We also don't want to burn people out. And just, by covering the simplistic, very simplistic way of looking at the issue. And we know that these are complicated, they are nuanced, and they require a different type of coverage. And so I want to talk about ways that we can go deeper in our hate crime coverage. And I'll explain it through our 4 pillars of complicating the narratives. And this is a training curriculum that we do for journalists. And it's focused on really covering complicated, difficult issues. A lot of our work is on divisive topics, but this does translate to hate crime coverage as well. And we can complicate the narrative and provide more nuance by listening differently. We're going to spend a lot of time on that, by going beneath the problem. And this is not just reporting on the simplistic binary ways of viewing things, but at a deeper level. By embracing complexity and also by countering confirmation bias. We do want to think about our own biases as well as journalists and how they can show up in the work that we do. So we'll touch upon loosely on the 4 pillars, but I want to really focus right now on doing a deep dive on listening, because when we cover harm, what really is essential that we listen differently to those communities that are affected and that are targeted. And there's a technique that we teach, and it's called looping. And I want to back up before I get into the technique. And you might be like, well, we're journalists and we listen. That's what we do. It's part of our job. And I have learned, and I think, Smriti discovered this too, and others that we've worked with, is that, while listening does come, we feel like it comes with the territory of being a reporter. In reality, many of us are just not that good at it. There are so many things that are competing for our attention. And oftentimes we're dealing with deadlines. There are internal and external things that are vying for our attention at any given moment. And when we cover stories about hate, it is absolutely essential that we are listening differently, that we are staying present with the people that we're talking with, that we are tuned in, we're focusing on them, and that they feel heard and understood, and as though we've been listening. When someone has experienced trauma, when a community has been targeted, They need to know there is a power dynamic that comes to us as journalists when we enter into communities, and we need to make sure that we are really explaining our role, the work that we do as journalists, what our process looks like, how we're covering this story, and why it's important for us to talk to individuals that have been affected. So kind of explaining our process is also key, because it can be, people don't know the ways in which we work, right? Our audiences, communities that we serve, they don't know what it takes to put together the work that we do and to produce a story, and be very clear and transparent about that. And also our role is to, to really just stop and listen. And so we've learned that this technique of looping can be really effective at just being present and listening deeply. And looping, it may sound very familiar to some of you. It might sound like active listening. There's just this extra step that it involves, but it was developed, the technique was developed by the Center for Understanding and Conflict. And it is something that, while conflict mediators use it and psychologists use it, it is applicable to the work that we do as journalists. And what happens when we loop during an interview is that we give our source space. And that is key, space to just pause, to reflect. It slows down the interview. When someone has been traumatized and they're dealing with trauma, we cannot come in and run and quickly move through an interview, quickly run through our list of the questions. It requires us to slow down, to make sure we understand what they're sharing, to make sure we understand their perspective, to generate clarity, to get a deeper sense of understanding in terms of what they're feeling, how this is impacting them, and so on. So this is really, we call it looping, but just really think about this as deep listening. And I will share this resource with all of you in the follow-up email, but this is, we're like, well, what is looping? Like, how does it work? And there are 4 steps to this. And the first is to just listen, and listen to really understand what your interview subject is saying, what they're sharing. And we're really listening for what's important to them. And then the second thing we do is just a few words. We communicate back to them what we understood in language that conveys understanding. And then we check in, we ask them, is that right? Did I get that right? Because it's important that they are accurately reflected. And they'll let us know, no, that's not what I meant. I actually meant this instead. And that's when that's important. That lets us know that we missed something. If we did get it right, they'll say, yes, that's about right, or that, yes, that's right. If they say that's about right, we missed something. But if they say that's about right, or that's kind of it, again, this is about slowing down. And so we're asking them, please let me know what I missed, because it's important for me to make sure that you are correct, you are accurately portrayed, and that I understand how you're feeling, how this has impacted you, what you're going through, what you want people to know. So if you missed it, we just, ask them what you missed, go through the steps again, right? And then when you are certain that you understand, you ask them, for what we do when it's a divisive topic is we say, tell me more. But there's a different layer of sensitivity that comes along with this type of coverage. And so we want to ask, how do you feel? Like, are you feeling okay? We're checking in. Would you like to tell me more? Is there more that is important for you to share? I want to make sure that you have the space that you need to share what's important to you about this, or what matters to you about this, or whatever that language might be. And so it's checking to make sure that, if there's more, we have the space to share more and to go deeper. And for the sake of, I'm wondering, I'm just checking on time, and we're not going to have, but I do have a video that I'm going to share with you. And it's just, this will be in the slide deck. For the sake of time, we won't be able to watch it, because I want to make sure that we have time to chat with Smriti and Pardeep. But please do check this out. It's just a very, it's an example of looping. A colleague of mine interviewed me using looping for a conversation about race and identity and ethnicity. And so you can check that out. Just get a sense of what we're talking about. And with that, I would like to turn this over to managing editor and journalist of the Rochester Beacon, Smriti Jacob, for just a brief conversation, Smriti, that we'll have. And you have learned complicating the narratives, you incorporate complicating the narratives, you used it in the coverage of the story that we see on the screen, which we'll share with everyone, the bigotry Asian Americans face. And I just wanted to start off, Smriti, by asking you, what is your process like? So when you intentionally set out to report a more nuanced story about intolerance and hate, how do you prep yourself? What does that look like for you?
Well, for this particular story, like what just going back to what Patrice said, that hate crimes weren't documented, right? So I didn't know, someone was punched or someone was hurt. I just wanted to find out if people were victims and how. So I went with that approach. So if I were to look at the data, it would say Rochester is fine. There's nothing going on here. We love everybody. So I went with, so that's how I prepped, is that there are no numbers to make me say, oh, there are millions of people who are being hurt, so this warrants a story. I went to it saying, who are these people? They're in our community. These are faces and people that people know. I mean, so I made it a point to sort of think of, I wanted this story to be one where people put a face to it. So make it personal and say, hey, I know in this story, I'm going to just pick a name. I know Pam Kim. Pam Kim is known for, she is at every Black Lives Matter rally, and you see her everywhere. And yet she suffers, hate, and she's a victim of hate crime. So I wanted to sort of look at people who were active in our community, and also look at people who were like a cashier at a grocery store, so I wanted to sort of say that, yes, they can be, had a state senator. So I wanted to sort of say, at different levels, it doesn't matter what level of society you are at or what job you have. You wear your race and culture, as I heard the other day, on your face. And sometimes that's enough for a crime. That's it. That's all. You don't even have to say anything. You just, is how you look. And so I wanted to sort of, that's how I prepared. I prepared by saying, this cannot be, I go and talk to a Chinese person, a Korean person. Asia is huge. Yeah. So first of all, I wanted readers to know that it's not just the Korean, it's not just the Chinese, and it's people who look like me. So I wanted to sort of dispel. So I had these sort of things where I wanted to present this as it is so much more complex than just, I don't like that person, and then that there's history to it. And so then that's how I approach it. I did not expect it to be a simple one-dimensional story. Yeah. I don't know if I answered your question.
No, you did. So you talked about, and you kind of used the fact, so that the data wasn't there, but you knew that there was something going on. So you kind of continued, you sought out to figure out, how is this, how are you being affected? How have acts of hate, essentially, in so many words, come into your home, or, it impacted you and your space in this community. And you knew that there was more that wasn't being shared. And so it was a matter of really kind of doing, then that makes me think, in terms of kind of looking for, really doing your work and being intentional about, how is this affecting people? And you showed the nuances, all the ways in which people are thinking about this. So you really did get beneath the problem. And that's something we talk about with Complicating the Narratives, is asking questions in a way that allow people to really share what their values are, what their passions are, what their hopes are for their community, their motivations, and so on. And we have a list of 22 questions to complicate the narrative. And I wonder, what question did you find to be your questions? If you did, you can tell me if you didn't, of those questions that were really useful for you in this coverage, for this story, and in this type of coverage that you found to be effective in getting people to open up and to go deeper.
If you can pull up the list of questions, I might be able to answer that. But a lot of this has become instinctive for me, the whole complicating the narrative thing. So I've sort of owned it and sort of honed it to my personality and my way of asking questions. I would say for this particular story, I was looking at looping, and I was the 4 steps, and I was trying to remember how I do it. One thing that I went in with every interview was to not think of myself as an Asian American. I was just a journalist. And I was just asking them to tell me their story. And I also, you talked about confirmation bias, and instead of saying, like if someone said, someone drove their car and pushed me off the road. That was one of the incidents. And then, asked me to go back to China. And I remember my next question is not, oh, I understand. I wonder how that felt. I always say, how did it make you feel? Mm-hmm. What did you feel in that instant? Mm-hmm. Were you angry? Were you upset? And then that sort of takes, so I sort of look at it as peeling an onion. I start with really basic questions, especially when you're covering something like this. They're afraid. They're so afraid of talking. I had one source who didn't want to give her name. She was so afraid. She works in in the public defender's office, and she was afraid she would be targeted. And so she didn't want to say who she was. And so I had to comfort her with that, I'm here to hear her story. I know, Helene, I'm not answering your question really directly with the types of questions I use, but I just wanted them to tell me their story, and I wanted it to be personal. Yeah. And I did not want to say, oh, do you see what's happening in California? Or do you see I just wanted to know what's happening to them, that person. How did their daily life get affected by this? Yeah. People don't shop at departmental stores anymore. They go to ethnic stores to shop because they feel safer there. Or I wouldn't know those things if I just said, do you think there's hate crime? And they would say yes. Yeah. And that would be okay. Then I don't have anything to go on. But knowing, and then people's journeys, like people came here from this, I learned how, how many Korean adoptees live in our community. And how they have Caucasian names or white names, and yet they're they face this victimization by being with having Asian features. Like I said again, you wear race on your face, and so all of that. I don't know. I'm not answering a question.
No, but you did.
I don't remember those questions.
Okay. Well, I know one question that you ask is how does this personally affect you? And that's something that you told me. That's one of the 22 questions. And so I know that that's something that you do ask. And you also covered, and what I think was interesting, you said, I didn't go into this story and this coverage as a woman of color, or as an Asian American. I went in just because you didn't want that to at all impact any assumptions, because you knew that could impact assumptions. You wanted to stay curious because you understood that their experiences will be very different from the next person's, which will be different from the next person's, which will be different from the next person's. And I think that's really important to do.
And also different from mine. I mean, it doesn't mean that I haven't had experiences. So I had to really shut that off because, like our state senator, he is an adoptee, Jeremy Cooney, who is Indian by birth, adopted by a single mother. here in Rochester. His middle name is Akbar, which is a Muslim name. And just understanding all those nuances there. So he not only, when he was growing up, did he have to sort of explain to his classmates where he came from, he had to explain why he had a Muslim middle name. And so then he quickly learned to say Jeremy A. Cooney, and nobody asks him. So these are all these ways how we protect ourselves, you know, as victims, to be able to do our jobs or just have a normal day. So yeah.
I want to close. I'm going to be mindful of time, but I want to close with embracing complexity and nuance. And we have found in our research that complexity does keep people engaged, and you can embrace it. And Patrice mentioned this too. Even just talking about the history, right? Asking, what is the history of this place? You know, what's happened here and has caused harm, and it's still in people's minds. How have other communities really grappled with similar acts of hate, and what are the positive actions that they took? Or are taking rather, you know, in addition when it comes to addressing it. And, you know, these types of questions and thinking about the historical context, even geographical context as well, is necessary. And it can be helpful in terms of, you know, showing the many layers of the piece of the story and the issue, but also kind of thinking through, you know, how do we address this? What are action steps? What are things that we can take or do to move forward? And I just wanted to kind of end this last question with you and find out, you know, how do you personally as a journalist, whether with this story or others that you've covered about intolerance, how do you embrace complexity? And are there suggestions that you might have for journalists on how to do that?
Well, with the Asian Americans, it was easy because I had a specific group, and I generally travel back in time. So I look for documents to see if, like, again, what Patrice said, history of harm, to sort of document to see how long have we lived with this, what kind of forms has it taken. And so while I didn't have the luxury of like going at it a lot, or the model minority myth. And I wanted to bring in all these things so that people could see that it's not just a single pane of glass that we're looking through. And I'll close with this by saying, you know, when I suggested this idea in the newsroom, a couple of reporters said, Asian Americans are so nice. I don't think there's anything going on here. Wow. And that for me was enough to do the story. Or like, why would anyone not like them? You know, and they're so smart, you know, again, so going back, so that's what made me want to tell a more complex story and find those complexities.
All right, we get to the Q&A. We'll see if any questions that people have. But for now, Smriti, thank you for the work that you're doing. And our community is definitely better off because of it. So with that, you know, there are things that journalists need to know about hate crime trauma and the impact on communities. And Patrice, I'll turn it over to you and Pardeep. And I also realized that I did not stop sharing my screen for you, Smriti, so I apologize. And would you like me to do that, Patrice? Stop sharing the screen.
No, it's fine.
Okay.
Well, actually, let's put Pardeep on speaker, like so speaker view. So Teresa, maybe you can do that so we can hear from Pardeep in this next section. And thanks for being there and hanging out outside. So Pardeep, I think so many of us think about what happens in the aftermath of something as horrific as the attack at the Sikh Temple of Wisconsin on August 5th, 2012. And of course, people want to understand what's happening to the families and to people who were harmed. Can you tell us about what it was like for you and your family? So maybe Helene, let's go to stop sharing your screen and just seeing Pardeep. Yeah. So tell us about your experience with the media in the days and weeks after the attack on the Sikh Temple of Wisconsin.
Sure. Yeah, I think just
part of our call was really to control the narrative and take the narrative back. I think there is a preoccupation that America has with, and I'll just say whiteness. And I don't mean to put anybody on blast as far as like, but there is we center around either the perpetrator, or we center around the person with power, or we center around those that have power. We adjacent ourselves to all of that. So it's really to reclaim not just a sense of what happened to us, but to say, we're much more than that. We're much more than what happens to us. And I think that was really like what we wanted to make sure that we did. We want to speak on behalf of those that lost their loved ones. Some of them were first generation immigrants. So we kind of knew that it was difficult for them to speak up for themselves. And I think just as we report on some of the stuff, there's so many different dynamics that happen within different communities with hate crimes, and to really be attuned to what is happening within that community. And so as as we go forward, I think one of the readings that I was thinking about as you all were talking was just like deep empathetic listening. And Carl Rogers is probably, and I'm always going to talk from a kind of a psychosocial standpoint, but Carl Rogers was just one of those people that was, he wrote the book about how you connect by deep empathetic listening. And this is just a must-have if you're going to engage in any part of that work. And for many times, like reporters, journalists, you are, and I say teachers, we're all community, and we act as so much more than just our profession. We are oftentimes counselors. We are first responders. We are, we're there during those times. And so we have responsibility not only to ourselves to take care of ourselves, but to the community at large.
I felt so clearly and saw so clearly that you and other members, particularly the young people of the Sikh Temple of Wisconsin, I think you and your brother and your cousin Kanwar were very much a part of that leadership of getting young people out there and speaking to the community about Sikhism, about your faith, about who you are, to try to understand it. I think the other thing is that you were very transparent about what you needed as a community, right? And what you thought people should do. Was that something that you sat around and talked about? Was that something that, knowing you now, I think it's sort of innate Pardeep, but innate Kaleka, because all of you are like that. But talk about that process. When you're in deep trauma, you just lost your dad. I mean, even your mom's like in such deep grief is finding her voice to speak.
Yeah, I think just the spirit. We didn't sit around and intentionally talk about it, but there is a spirit of defiance that I think human beings innately have, and to say, you know what, F you, you're not going to get to do this, and you're not going to get to take this. And I think that even we talked about sexual assault survivors and how that feeling is so far in. Right. Sometimes just the level of intimacy that somebody goes through with their trauma will oftentimes dictate how far that journey is that they need to come out of. So for us, I just, my dad was 65 years old. My mom survived. With that said, there was this sense of like, I'm 30 some years old, and I need to be able to make sure that we can, again, reclaim power. And it wasn't just power for just myself or somebody else or this person, but it was really, like you talked about it, it was for the youth to say, sometimes the sanctuary walls that we exist in, right, keep us safe, but those sanctuary walls also keep us constrained. And I cannot let you as a small minority community stay restrained to those community walls, because you have a responsibility. And this responsibility was given to you before you ever arrived to this country. And that's what this country is about. So in the spirit of defiance, you will go and you will take that back. Now, I didn't say all that at that time, but there was that spirit of defiance of, you know what? No, this is not going down like this. Now, this guy was an affiliated white supremacist. You kind of knew what his motivation was. right? And it's been the motivation of white supremacy in this country and in other countries for a very long time. So I think that's the charge that we have going forward of like, how do we define what we want? How do we define, and how does the media help define that? How do we shed light on unraveling that and saying, you know what, we all have a responsibility, not just those kids that were inside those sanctuary walls, but you as a reporter, as a journalist, have a responsibility. And if that story is centering around what happened or who did it and this and that, and again, people hold different, and I actually say this too, people hold things differently. So understanding that my dad was a little bit older, he had lived a good life, he had done what he needed to do, understanding that some of those other families had younger children. They barely knew their dads. They didn't get to live their life as long. So people hold pain differently. A sexual assault survivor that has gone through, and then I'm not comparing this, right? Because comparison can sometimes be violence too. But just again, I just held that in a way to say, you know what, I personally have a responsibility, and I don't have that far to go. So, and I talk about the journey like this. You know, if you can touch your pain, you can hold your pain. If you can hold your pain, you can control your pain. And so, while I would never say to any journalist or reporter, say, go ahead and go publicize the shooter's name, right? Because I don't want that to be centered. When there was a film crew that was in Patrice, and then they said, Pardeep, why is it that you use the shooter's name, full name too? You know, I will straight up use Wade Michael Page, and I will advertise it to the world and be like, you know what, this dude right here did this, and this is what came out of it. And I told him, I said, I only do that because I know that what came out of that was the spirit of defiance, and I want to magnify that. And I want everybody to know who's out there that's glamorizing this person, that if you do this, then the community will be much more connected than they ever were before. Multiculturalism will thrive. And this white dominance or white supremacy that exists will die along with him. And I think there's a different responsibility for journalists and people that are in that place, that they can get to that place of like, okay, I can control it.
Yeah, I think words that you can say and words that we probably can avoid or need to avoid. And I'm thinking about naming the perpetrator, and so much of the story, Waking in Oak Creek. Well, I mean, I think we say his name once, and but the story isn't about him. It is about you, about the community response. And I can't even imagine that story, making that story about the perpetrator. I think we've seen it over and over again. And it's not to say that there shouldn't be a movie about people who are perpetrators to try to understand them. I remember going over and over again to screenings, and people would say, why don't you do more about the perpetrator? And I honestly want to tear my hair out. It's sort of like, why do we keep asking that question? Why do we keep asking that question about the need to like focus on the serial killer, right? I mean, it's like, why do we keep doing that as a society? And it's not that it isn't important to understand people's motivations and try to unpack it, but we are missing so much of the story if we constantly fall into that narrative and say that that is the most important thing that we cover. And
you know, Patrice, you did say something. There is a very sort of perverse relationship that America has with the perpetrator of violence. I mean, we glamorize serial killers, we glamorize rapists, we glamorize people who harm other people, we glamorize, and a lot of times this glamorization does come center around like men, right? Men who do this. It's not as much around women who hurt, or women like, so there's something very, very deep in the subconscious of America. And then I'll tell you, like, a lot of times as Arno and I travel, and Arno is a former white supremacist that we partnered up with afterwards, I have never gotten the subconscious response of, Pardeep, you reached out to him. It's almost like there's almost like he must have been the one that reached out to you, Pardeep, while you were suffering and hurting. And I'm like, okay, cool, good story.
Not the truth, however.
Not at all. But that's what and sometimes even like within Arnold's subconscious, I'm like, hey, like, has someone ever said to you that Pardeep reached out to you? Did they ever assume that without us intentionally telling that? He's like, no. And I'm like, well, I've gotten it like hundreds of times. And so there is like this, again, this centering around the white savior, the white, all, like the perpetrator or the savior. And either way, where's the power?
I really wanted to add that story, and I think you have such a way of complicating the narrative every time I talk to you, and that I appreciate so much. And your thoughts about reaching out to Arno. Arno formed a group called Life After Hate. He was a violent white supremacist in his youth and stepped out. And I guess it was maybe about 6 months after your dad died, you decided, you'd heard about him and you decided to reach out to him. What was that for you? Yeah,
that was just again, it was about getting our community out of their trauma walls, right? It's to say, hey, if I can model this for you, you have no excuse not to do this. So as much as it was for, I didn't know there was a bigger mission on that. I really just, I knew that there was people inside. There was children who never wanted to see a white person come into the temple. And I could have understood and said, you know what, let me leave your trauma alone. But at the same time, I was like, no, I can't do that, because then this self-fulfilling prophecy of being that way just happens. And now I got to lovingly challenge you out of this. So I think that was, as much as it was for me, it was definitely for community and for us to get out of those. And sis, I was Helene, I was thinking about the loop before. So I should decipher the difference between. So again, I'm going to speak from a trauma clinician lens, right? There's also something called a trauma loop. So the difference between a listening loop for reporters and a trauma loop is basically, these trauma loops are PTSD loops. And the most common ones are disassociation loop and the dangerous world loop, or the spiraling loop. And when I was working with clients, I did a lot of work with men getting out of prison or jail, and then I did a lot of work with sexual assault survivors. One of the things that I looked out for was when I saw somebody start the loop, meaning that they would start to go on a story and just cement their reality, and they probably have told the story a million times. And what happens is they tell it the same way over and over and over and over again. And what they don't do is, again, they don't critically think that story. They just think that it's going to happen. And I'm fearful that America kind of does exist in a somewhat trauma loop, meaning that we're seeing the same thing happen over and over and over and over again. So I should just, as you were talking about the listening loop, definitely the listening loop is the way to get out of the trauma loop. But the trauma loop is the loop that sometimes people exist in, and there's 7 main types of trauma loops. We don't have time to go into all those things, but it is something for journalists and reporters to kind of listen to and be like, okay, am I getting the whole story, or is this person just looping again?
So I'm worried that we're running out of time, and I know people have a lot of questions for Smriti and Pardeep. Helene, do you want to open it up for questions from the panel?
Please. Yes. So let's, I dropped something in the chat. So please, any questions that you have, put them in the Q&A box, or you can also drop them in the chat too. Sometimes that's just easier and it might be more convenient for you. So let's see, we've got one from Jody. It says, do you know of programs anywhere in the country that are successfully addressing the communication gaps and misunderstandings that lead to violence and trauma between law enforcement and the communities they are working in. So that one I will give to, who would like to take? I do not successfully addressing the communication gaps and misunderstandings that lead to violence and trauma between law enforcement and the communities they are working in.
You know, community-oriented police strategies out of DC. That's some of the work that they tried to do, and a lot of 21st century policing is what that was all about. I would say, and I'm not trying to be political, I'm just being real. The last 4 years has not done a service to going towards community-oriented policing. I think that the new administration that is there now will try to move that forward. But you need people, law enforcement, ex-law enforcement, that really can navigate the culture of all of that and hold people accountable. You need police chiefs in roles that are much more innovative and not part of like the old guard. And I think the old guard is just kind of like this punishment model and lack of so I think that furthers that sense of trauma. You need law enforcement officers to also be attuned when they're seeing it and when they're seeing mental health crisis. There's a lot of calls that exist that end up in violence that should be a crisis call from a social services standpoint. So there's just so much work, and that's such a great question. But there are people who are going to start to get into that work now, I think, and we'll see how it goes.
Yeah, so I think we've tried to cover this issue over time. Helene and I did a film together called Camden's Turn about police reform, work on police reform in Camden, New Jersey. And in a lot of our conversations, or a lot of our films, there are the community and the law enforcement interact. You know, we've also seen the trauma from racism and bigotry in policing and in communities, racial profiling of police, particularly towards Black people, but people of color, and the community sort of weaponizing law enforcement against people of color. So really complicated issues, part of the whole larger story as we think about this. I think getting underneath that whole picture of how racism and bigotry and the history is such an important part of this work and examination of this work. You know, there's so many answers to that. I think that's a quest that I think those of us who do this work have been trying to respond to for so many years. Some other questions that are emerging?
None have popped up yet, but I want to pose one to Smriti and to Pardeep. And it's something that I've heard from journalists in the trainings that we've done. And there's this question about just, you know, how do, when an act of hate has taken place and a community is targeted, what is the best way to approach? There's this, and especially if it's a journalist that is not a journalist of color, and that might not be familiar with how, you know, the impact of this, there's just kind of a little bit of a hesitation and a fear factor in terms of how do I walk into this? How do I build trust? Like, how do I, what does that look like? There's just, and they hesitate to do that. And what we hear so much is, you know, well, let's give that story to the journalist of color. And that doesn't change, that doesn't fix the problem, right? Like that doesn't work at all. So what suggestions might you have for journalists that are doing that and do have that fear factor?
So this is me.
We can start with you, and then and then because Pardeep has experienced the other, you know, working with journalists, what's worked well for him, what he has found in terms of what journalists have done that he believes have been particularly useful and helpful.
I think I find that, you know, as looking at, there was another question about like talking about the many sides of trauma, and a person who wants to write this story about this traumatized sheriff. I think just For me, what has worked, so even if, say, I was to interview a white policeman, right? So I would be coming from a different sort of, there would be a new area for me. I find that people, if you gain their trust by just first asking about them. I find people really, I don't know, in all the stories that I've done, is that people want to be heard. And even if it takes long, and like you said, these are not quick stories, your interview may go longer, but somehow I find that also adds context. So while you may think I cannot relate to this person or this incident, you might find something along the way. So, a simple question like, why did you join? How did you join the police force? If I were to use that example, who inspired you? What were you? I may not use any of that, if that's not the focus of my story, but it also shows me who this individual is, and helps me build on that. So that's what I use, is sort of trying to understand the person as a person and as a human, and his or her title or role in the community later, like seeing them as people.
Seeing them as a person first.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think that speaks to developing relationships, proactive relationships, making sure that you're part of the community. That speaks to the experience and maybe the tenure of the reporter to try to be there a little bit longer, and not transitioning jobs and things like that, and the importance for broadcasters or companies to kind of know that, is that valuing the experience of that person being in that and having those relationships. I think journalists have to be really good and keen at like picking up on nuances, meaning like there's things that you can notice about a person, the way like 80% of what we say is through body language. Mm-hmm. So picking a time that you can kind of move in, rather than a time that you're kind of going to be like, okay, let me, this person is talking to, this person is right, so we go through we're all emotional people. We all go through a plethora of emotions. Try to find that place that you can kind of say, okay, this might be my opening right here. And maybe just the last thing is for you, don't be so offended by people's pain. If somebody is expressing to you their pain, kind of welcome it, whether it's good, bad, ugly, or in between. I think it's still pain, and we just need to, as a society, to get better at listening to it and not being offended by it.
Mm-hmm. I wrote that down. Yes. Don't be offended by people's pain.
So
welcome it. Yeah, absolutely. And I think you mentioned something too that I think is important, is the body language and recognizing that sometimes, whether it's different cultures, different ethnicities, different people in trauma, we experience things differently. And so I might be smiling as I'm talking about something that has been incredibly painful for me, because that just is my response. I'm dealing with this, and there's a smile on my face, and it looks as though I'm not affected. But in reality, I am processing many, many things in here and in here. And so really tuning into that and recognizing, I, as a journalist, thinking about that looping we talked about, and being able to loop the emotions and what we see and say, this is incredibly painful. And I see that, you're smiling, and I know that I understand based on what you're telling me that's not indicative of the pain that you are feeling right now. And I just want you to know that I see that and I recognize that. And that is acknowledging, that is not being offended by that person's pain and what that person is going through, and making sure that you let the person know, I see it.
Yeah, and that's a common response to pain. It's called incongruent response, right? You have somebody who is smiling through pain, and you know that as a child they had gone through something very traumatic maybe, and had to smile through that, and so they develop coping mechanisms to deal with life, and that are just showing up on you. But so that's very natural. I mean, kids, you see it all the time. I used to see it with educators. I used to come to me and say, I'm showing this scary movie, and all of a sudden this child starts to laugh, and I'm like, it's common. It's not that they're laughing at the movie or the pain or the person suffering, is that's the way that they have dealt with their own pain.
So, Helene, I don't know if Charlie is still in the call, but maybe, unfortunately, he can't contribute, but it'd be good to get the perspective of someone who has followed a community responding to hate and intolerance and working to prevent it for many years. Charlie's gone. Oh, too bad. I was hoping to hear from him because he has done radio programs year after year as issues emerge in the community. There's a go-to group of people in this town that have experience, and I think that communication, both with the newspaper and the radio stations, is so important. I'll give you an example. Right after Ferguson, the Not in Our Town group, the NAACP, and the police chief were on the radio immediately talking about, okay, what's happening in Ferguson? What's happening in our own community? How do we make sure, something like this doesn't happen? There isn't the murder of a young Black man, that the community and the police department can have conversations. So it is this persistent engagement on the part of the community and relationship between the journalist and this group as sources of people to engage that I think becomes really important. Finding those go-to sources and thinking about who they are and just hearing from them, not just in traumatic moments, but if you want to get under the hate crimes reporting gap, you go to those groups who might have their ears to the ground and say, what are you hearing about attacks on Muslims? What are you hearing about anti-Asian attacks? What are you hearing about anti-Semitic attacks, right? So, because, for us, we're doing a story now about the attack at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. And, when that happened, it was shocking, obviously horrific. 11 people were murdered. But this is something that we had seen coming. We had been hearing about this rise in anti-Semitism, particularly among young people, right? Because on these gaming sites, there are all these sort of joke sites that young people are getting recruited into. And then you go in there and there's filled with anti-Semitic memes. So there are a lot of opportunities to sort of get underneath these issues that can turn to violence, right? These horrific acts of bigotry and hate that can turn to violence, especially if we develop sources and are listening to folks in our community who may not, be the leading citizens in our town, but they have their ears to the ground. They know what's going on.
All right, so we do want to be mindful of time. And we know that you are very busy and we want to end on time. So we'll turn this over, just a closing word from Smriti and Pardeep to help close us out today. And Smriti, I'll toss to you first.
Thank you for having me. I learned so much. And Pardeep, I've heard about you. So for me, this was an honor. Thank you. I would have never, ever imagined I'd be on a panel with you when I heard about you before. So thank you for teaching me something. Thank you, Patrice. Thank you for teaching us all to use a different lens and to complicate the narrative. Thank you, Helene.
I just want to thank everyone as well. And I can't wait to read your writings. So it's been great to have this discussion. I think that journalism as we go forward, I know that I think it was a Pew Research that talked about just the distrust that we've seen in journalism and sort of the divisions and the way that different people of different political beliefs look at certain journalism and certain channels and certain stations and broadcasts with a different lens. Some of the work we can say is just journalism, or is just publications, or is just broadcasts, or whatever. But I think the work that you all do is really about bringing people together and people closer to their true selves, their genuine selves. You are unraveling lots of trauma, and part of that is finding the complexities and making sure that you are bearing witness in those moments. Again, I didn't read the stuff from Carl Rogers, but page 8 through, you don't have to read the whole book. Just read pages 8 through 10, and it talks about just what a freeing experience it is for a journalist to really deeply listen to somebody. And it's just not about getting the story, but it's about helping a person get to a place where they are free of the pain that was inflicted upon them. So I thank you all, and God bless you all.
Pardeep, I was looking for the link to the book, but I was having a little trouble, and I wanted to be focused because multitasking is not my friend, a way of being. Okay, great. So we'll share that as well in the follow-up resources that we send. So I will, Patrice, would you like to close us out? I'll just briefly say you will get everything, all the resources we've talked about, and a follow-up email. And, I think this is about continuing the conversation. So I think we at Solutions Journalism Network, I know Patrice and Teresa, with Not in Our Town, we see ourselves as resources and wanting to help. So when things come up, or if any ideas or questions, please do email us. And I genuinely mean that. Patrice.
Thank you. I'll put my contact information in the chat, and it's been wonderful to be here. Thank you so much for thinking about doing this, Helene. It's always such a joy to work with you and Smriti and Pardeep. Thanks again, and to my colleague Teresa.
Thank you all so much. Thank you for joining us. And we're gonna just serenade you with a little something. This is my colleague from the Solutions Journalism Network, Kristen Merritt, the talented Kristen Merritt, and we'll let her close us out.
It starts about the way you think you would. It starts about the way you think it should. A story told at a lonely age. I tried and failed to be your only one. Writing a script that ends with credits rolling. Music plays dim the sun. But seasons change and things won't stay too warm. I seem to play as if it was forever, eternal, so late. Knowing the truth will rear its ugly head. Though what's the use? No one dare ever said. Bring an umbrella to a perfect, boundless day. I wanna feel the rain, wanna feel the rain, wash away my pain, never again will I hurt again. I wanna feel the rain when I say your name. We know there was a mess when you were there. They're not with me. What are the words you speak? What kind of truth do you keep? But this is what we're taught. A sunset can't be bought. Let bygones be gone. Let tryhards belong to traditions as they pass. Wishing on everlasting, got no one anywhere. I wanna feel the rain, wanna feel the rain, wash away my pain, never again will I hurt again. I wanna feel the rain when I say your name. We know there was a mess when you were there.
That was groovy.
Oh,